How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 267 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is one I've been looking forward to for a while. So it's, delighted to be joined this week by Ben Raskin, who's head of agroforestry with the Soil Association. He's also the author of many books. I'll probably find out that number quite soon. And there's books like the wood chip handbook, silva horticulture. There's books on agroforestry and so much more. Obviously, the Soil Association as well. We can chat a bit about that. So that's going to be really interesting. Quite a trusted body, in the UK and Ireland. And as I said, there's loads of kind of potential avenues here. We're going to center the episode, I guess, around silva horticulture, which is the incorporation of trees into crops. And where that'll become relevant, I suppose, in the garden situation is in the likes of food forests, which are starting to become popular. And I suppose there's a bit of a lack of understanding of food forests and how they operate, but silva horticulture is going to be kind of a similar vein. So we'll get some insight into it. Soil health, I know, is also something that Ben is quite a strong advocate for. So again, something that we talk about a lot on the podcast. So yeah, there's loads of potential avenues here. And Ben, you're very, very welcome to Master My Garden podcast.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, as I said, there's loads of potential avenues. You have many books out. I wasn't quite sure the figure. There seems to be a lot. Do you know that figure offhand or
Eight.
eight
Yeah,
books?
eight. So yeah.
And it's everything from like your most recent one, if correct me if I'm wrong, is the wood chip handbook.
No, the most recent is the silver horticulture one that I co-wrote with Andy Dibben,
Okay,
who, if you haven't yet had on, I would recommend getting him on because he's amazing as well.
right, yeah.
So my background is horticulture. So I was a veg grower for 12 years or so. And they say it's only in the last probably 10, 15 years that I've started to focus more on the trees and the agroforestry stuff. So
Yeah. And when you say you were a vegetable grower, like what kind of scale was it, or what kind of format were you growing in?
So a range, but sort of up to about 10 acres, 12 acres. That was sort of the biggest I was growing.
Yeah.
But I ran a walled garden in Sussex for a while. I worked for a horticultural college up in North Wales. So yeah, a few bits and pieces, but sort of small to medium scale, selling into, box schemes, farm shops, bit of wholesale, that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you've always grown organically. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the wall garden, my very first job, despite my best efforts, we weren't quite organic. They
Hmm.
couldn't stop spraying the paths. But apart from that,
Yeah. So that's kind of your grounding in horticulture is that sort of organic ethos and so on. And I did see a video on your Instagram profile earlier of you were sort of given a not a history, but you were saying that you came from organic horticulture and then you transitioned into silva horticulture and the incorporation of trees into that. And that's, I suppose, what we're going to mostly center the episode on. But we will talk about other things like soil health and so on. So maybe give us the little bit of the story from, the organic market garden style that you were growing and to where you started to incorporate or why you started to incorporate trees into your practice or where you started to see those benefits.
yeah, I guess like probably most gardeners, most growers, I'd always had some trees as part of the mix. So I'd always had some apple trees, some fruit trees, and I always loved working with them. Pruning is probably one of my favorite gardening tasks. I really enjoy the the sort of slightly meditational state of it, but you still got to think about it a little bit, and it's quite creative. But I hadn't really, I think, considered what the trees were doing to the system. I'd seen them in isolation. And it was probably about 15 years ago when I first came across the concept of agroforestry and started looking a bit more at sort of, I guess, all the benefits that trees bring, both to the world at wide and to the garden or the field itself. That I started to investigate this. And I mean, God, it's massive topic, so I'm still so ignorant. It's one of the classic things of the more you learn, the more you realize quite a little you know.
Yeah.
But it's extraordinary, and we're scratching the surface. And I guess the other big driver for me is around how we cope with climate change, the mitigation to some extent through carbon sequestration, all of that stuff, but actually more urgently for me is just how we keep producing food in the face of really uncertain climate, and trees buffer us at both extremes of hot, cold, windy, wet, all of that stuff. They help to keep us going, I guess. So yeah, that's what's driving me really.
Yeah, I said that this episode will be kind of linked. I covered an episode a couple of weeks ago, so we've Tree Week here in Ireland coming up, which is it's quite an important. It's when this podcast goes live. It's actually the week that this podcast goes live, and I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and Henrik Schoeman was there chatting about trees and the urban environment, and the cooling effect and the attenuation of water and all of those things. And it was really interesting. And from a gardening stroke, market garden stroke, agriculture perspective, there's huge benefit in trees. And I guess, like as you said, it's a huge and complex topic, and we won't necessarily get into too much of the technical data. But what is the benefits of trees in the garden? And it's funny because I live on a farm here, and if I was only walking through the fields the other day, and we have quite mature hedgerows, and the fields are quite yellow at this time. Not yellow, but they're not as green as they will be once the temperatures rise in a few weeks' time. But all along under the trees is just lush. It looks lush. And there's that element of it. Then in times when we get little periods of drought, which we are getting with a little bit more frequency, again, if you look under the trees, right directly under the tree might be a little bit burnt, but in that root zone area, it seems to be the grass is greener than it is in the fields. So there's clearly, and this is my very basic information on it, but there clearly is a benefit in having trees, plants in that root zone. So what exactly is happening there? Why am I seeing that?
So I think there's a few things we can talk about. So there's the soil, which is one thing. There's the shade, and the effect that intercepting sunlight has on crops, and there's shelter, and then there's also the influence that the trees have on water movement. So maybe if we start with let's start with the shelter, maybe, and the fact that if you're in the shelter of a tree, you're typically 4 or 5 degrees warmer than if you're in
Hmm.
open ground. So immediately you've raised the temperature throughout your main growing season, assuming it's a deciduous tree. You've raised that temperature by 4 or 5 degrees. Now that might give you, I don't know, a couple of weeks each end of the season potentially.
Yeah.
And particularly what it does is it helps to warm up the soil a little bit early on, so you can get stuff out earlier. But the
Hmm.
other thing it does is it prevents physical damage. So particularly stuff like squash, for instance, which is really susceptible to wind in those early, those early phases of establishment. Where they might just get blown about in an open field, where they're sheltered, they can get away quickly and grow. So you can have a significant impact on both length of season and yield, potentially, if you get it right. And even stuff Andy talks about. So Andy, I co-wrote the book, the Silver Horticulture book with. He talks about the damage that happens to a lot of leafy crops. So for him, one of his big markets are chards, lettuce, spinach, all of that sort of stuff.
Hmm.
And if he gets a nasty wind across, it can shred the whole crop. So although in theory it's still edible, actually it's unsaleable.
Yeah.
Um, so for him, it's a really important part of protecting it, the physical bit of the crop as well. So that's shelter. So then the shade. So I guess we've got a bit of an assumption maybe in our heads that we need full sun for our vegetable crops.
Hmm.
And sort of in our mind, we think, yeah, it's just they're out in the field, aren't they, with full
Yeah.
sun? But actually, most or a lot of vegetable crops don't need or want full sun, and they particularly don't want full sun when it's 35 degrees,
Yeah.
which we are now getting sort of fairly regularly. So particularly leafy crops, they can make do with maybe 2 to 4 hours of sunlight a day, and they can be in semi-shade the rest of the time. And actually things like lettuce really like being in the shade in the hot summers. So reevaluating in a way what your crop needs in terms of sun, but then also thinking about how the sun moves across the sky and where the shade is falling at different times of day and at different times of year. You can start to be quite clever about how you plan your rotations and how near to the tree you put them. So something like garlic, for instance, you could plant almost under the tree because it's quite shallow rooted and it's done most of its growing by the time the tree's coming into leaf. Whereas other stuff, tomatoes or sweet corn or something, you'd want further away where it is going to get full sun. So
Yeah.
you can play around a little bit like that. I mean, the water is probably a bit more obvious. When you've got tree roots that are breaking up the soil and helping infiltration and all of that stuff, then it just allows you to dry out more quickly. So again, particularly in early spring, if the soil's a bit damp, if you can get it dry a bit quickly, you can get maybe a couple of weeks extra season, but also just it stops it getting clogged and wet and claggy. So particularly if you've got heavy soils, it can really help.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So, and they're the sort of, I suppose, what you'd call the obvious ones, and I guess there is some benefits. I've had Jeff Lowenfels on the podcast in the past, and he has spoke about bacteria transfer and root exegetes and so on, and of which I don't understand. I'm not a scientist, but I do understand when there's benefit in something and you can see it. But I don't understand what's actually happening there. But clearly there is benefit, because if you look, in a forest or in an edible forest setting, you're getting really, really good plant health. Typically, you're getting your crops do extremely well, less disease and so on. So there's something happening there around that as well. Are you able to sort of elaborate on that, or is that the sort of the
No,
minefield that?
absolutely. Well, I mean, it is a minefield in one sense. I'm no soil scientist either, but there's we know that diverse systems are more productive. Monocultures are they're efficient from a human labor point of view, but that's about it. They
Yeah,
don't work as self-sustaining natural systems. So the more diversity we can include, the better, which goes back into your introductory point about the food forests, and those multi-layered things, which in a garden you can certainly create. When we're growing commercially, it's harder to do that because you still got to get machinery in
yeah,
and sort of make a living. But the I guess what's happening, your point about the exudate. So typically a plant only uses maybe half to 2/3 of what it produces in terms of food for its own benefit. The rest it pushes out through the roots to feed soil organisms and exchange that sugar effectively for other minerals that it needs. So
yeah,
it's desperately trying to encourage all of these soil organisms to come and live around its roots, so that they can all live and breed and exchange all of these nutrients. And a tree will be there permanently. So often we'll put in a green manure crop, and that will do that job a bit, but then we dig it in, and we disturb the soil and we break up all of that habitat. And one of the things that's particularly beneficial about planting trees is you create the habitat for fungi. So fungi typically hate being disturbed. They don't like
yeah,
being dug. They don't like being sprayed. They don't like anything. They just like to be left alone under the tree. And basically, as soon as you plant a tree, then you're not doing anything under it. Typically you leave it, because otherwise you're going to damage the tree roots. So you're creating this perfect habitat for fungi. And then the fungi is able to transport nutrients from further away. So whereas a lot of the things like bacteria and nematodes and those other little creatures that are living immediately around the roots, they're relatively immobile. They can move around a little bit, most of them, but and obviously things like worms can travel a bit more, but they won't be traveling 50 meters or 100 meters. Whereas fungi hyphae can grow, well, I mean, the biggest one is whatever 5 miles wide, isn't it?
Wow.
But typically they can all link up with each other and they feed into roots, and that's how trees talk to each other often, is through these fungal networks. So the more you can create bits of your garden that are undisturbed and linked to other bits, then that's going to be beneficial to the soil health. And bear in mind also, the trees are kind of constantly producing leaves, dropping leaves, building soil organic matter, building soil. So as long as your tree isn't so vigorous and big that it's out competing everything. So clearly there are going to be situations where you can't grow stuff under a big oak or something.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you get the balance right and you understand how the dynamics work, then you can really work it to your advantage.
Yeah. And I presume your book on the wood chip handbook, that's sort of fallen into the same category, like, because on the face of it, you're thinking, how can you write a full book about wood chip?
Not the first person
But
to have asked me that.
no, I'd imagine, but I suppose it's when you start to get into, what is happening with the fungal activity in the soil, that you can branch this out, and I guess that's what's happening. I haven't seen this book, so maybe tell us a little bit about it. And is it the kind of segue that we think it is here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what got me into wood chip actually was planting trees initially. So alongside the work I do at the Soil Association, I work for Helen Browning on her farm. So Helen's the chief exec of the Soil Association, but she also has a 1,500-acre farm in Wiltshire, and I sort of manage her agroforestry planting for her. And we were using a lot of wood chip to mulch, and basically the more mulch I put on, the better it was and the quicker the trees established.
Okay.
And then it sort of coincided with being involved in a few other projects, one with the Organic Research Centre and Ian Tolhurst Tolley, looking at ramial wood chip and spreading ramial wood chip. So that's the kind of the small stuff, the stuff from branches less than 7 centimeters in diameter,
Hmm.
and spreading that on soil and seeing the effect. And then we also ran an innovative farmers field lab looking at wood chip compost for propagation. So suddenly all these sort of stuff was coming up, going, God, wood chips more than just spreading on paths.
Yeah.
So that got me really interested. And then one of the other things I've started looking at. So unless you want just to grow fruit trees, which are great, obviously I love fruit trees, but once you get into bigger settings and farm settings, not everybody wants to grow fruit trees.
Hmm.
And one of the really nice crops, particularly for horticultural systems, is looking at coppice hazel, willow, anything really, but sort of older, that sort of thing, where you maintain the height of your trees by coppicing on a 2, 3, 4, whatever year cycle,
Hmm.
and so you're not you reduce the risk basically of having this massive tree that's sucking out nutrients and competing with your crops by controlling it, the height of it. And then if you start doing that, you go, what am I going to do with all of this material that I'm getting from this coppice thing? And so then you start going, well, actually, yes, you can chip it and then use it for all of these other things around the garden. That's really useful. So.
Yeah, and so in that scenario, so because I'm just thinking from an agroforestry point of view here, you were saying you spread wood chips on the land. So obviously, in a garden setting, as you mentioned, we've all seen it in the footpaths, and there's the obvious benefit there. You do see the mycelium building up, and it is adding over time. It breaks down, and that becomes nutrients and so on. So in that setting, we all understand the benefits of it. Are you saying that the likes of these chips would be spread on the land, as in grazing pastures, or is it just in food production beds, or is it where
Yeah,
is it?
you can do it anywhere really. So the idea with this is, because the smaller wood has a higher ratio of uh, nutrients, nitrogen and other nutrients and amino acids and things to carbon. So old wood typically is mostly carbon,
Yeah.
but the young wood has got more bark, and bark is where all the sort of exciting stuff is in the
Hmm.
tree. So you reduce the risk of nitrogen locking by using the young wood. And the idea is that you can spread it straight on the soil. So either, I mean, Tolly typically does it on his green manure phase of his rotation, which reduces, you know, any particular risk of locking up. But actually, it doesn't seem to be much risk if it's really young. And it's not like a mulch; it's like a sprinkling.
Yeah.
It's a soil amendment. It's almost like a soil health amendment. So rather than thinking of it as a mulch or as a fertilizer, it's more a sort of health booster, really,
Hmm.
and particularly helps with fungal populations and pushing the sort of fungi bacterial ratio a bit more towards the fungi.
Yeah.
So that's the concept, really. But yeah.
And you're spreading that fresh, or is it composted for a period of time first?
So the ramial, in theory, you can just compost fresh, and we're certainly looking. So the Helen's farm is mainly a livestock farm. There's not really much horticulture there, but we're looking at potentially coppicing some of it and just literally spreading it from the wood chipper out into the pasture.
Oh.
You know, maybe if it ends up a bit too piled up, we might have to run over it with some tines or something.
Hmm.
But yeah, you could potentially do that. But equally, you can compost it as well. And I would certainly say if you've got older wood chip from bigger branches, I would recommend probably composting it before you add it.
Yeah.
And certainly if you're growing stuff that's got really shallow or roots, or it's a really young plant, then I would definitely recommend composting it, and certainly not digging it in, because that's when you get some of the problems.
Hmm.
But for no dig beds, if you use really nice composted wood chip, it's great. Works really well.
Yeah. And so, technically, in a scenario like that, then if you're using this really young, really small chippings, you can do like a chop and drop effect. So you're
Yeah,
doing the same thing as chop and drop. You're putting it straight onto your beds in a thin enough
exactly.
layer, I guess, that you're not putting a big layer of it.
Well, it depends on what you're doing. So I mean, that's exactly what I've been doing this morning in my garden. Is I've pruning a shrub, and yeah, just laying it actually quite thickly underneath that
Hmm.
shrub, because that's going to be fine. If I was about to plant out my little vegetable seedlings there, then I'd want it a lot thinner, or
Yeah.
I'd compost it. So it depends a little bit on what you've got growing there, but yeah.
Yeah. So that's the wood chip handbook. Silva horticulture. I know we've talked a little bit about it, but it's it's something that's used relatively, I suppose, across. I've seen it going back 30 years ago in horticultural college. It was used to a certain extent, but I don't think it was more from the point of view of wind barrier than, they certainly weren't thinking about it from a soil health point of view or from any other point of view at that point in time. But it was starting to become popular. Have you seen, a switch in the last few years to more silver horticulture stroke agroforestry?
I think it's starting. I mean, I guess one of the things I hadn't really realized when I started all of this was it's an
Yeah.
ancient system, really. It's probably how we started farming.
Mm.
And in parts of the world like South America and Southeast Asia, it's still the norm for a lot of horticultural crops.
Yeah.
And so I think certainly in the UK and Ireland, I guess as well, it's just something we've forgotten about, and we're rediscovering it. And we know, I guess, a bit more about the science of why it works as well, which is nice. But it's yeah, and there are a few pioneering growers that have been doing it for a while. People like Alan Schofield, Ian Tolhurst, Martin Bragg down in Devon, um, the Wakelands agroforestry over in Suffolk. So there's people that have been trialing it for probably 20, 30 years, but they're relatively few. But I think in the last certainly 3, 4 years, there's been increasing interest, I think. And certainly, Andy and I wrote the book mainly because when we were developing systems, we just couldn't find any information. So we thought, well, probably other people would find this useful as well. And Andy always says, I wish I'd had this book when I started designing mine. I'd have done it all differently.
So is he farming himself now?
Yeah, so he's a grower at Abbey Home Farm near Cirencester, which I can't now remember exactly how many acres he's on, but he's got about 2 acres of glass and polytunnel, and then I think about another 15 acres of field veg and stuff. So yeah,
And he's using a silver horticulture system. And
he is, yeah.
what trees is he using? Is it a combination of nut trees, fruit trees?
Yeah, so fruit, some nut, and some coppice. Those would be his main ones. So again, in a way, like I talked about earlier, it's about he doesn't want really big trees. He supplies into. They have this incredible farm shop on their site, which basically supplies everything. They do pretty much everything on the farm: dairy, poultry, eggs. They have their own bakery, just about everything. So all of his fruit and veg goes through the shop. So that's his main driver. And they were buying in apples. So I thought, well, definitely we should be growing more apples.
Yeah, yeah.
But equally, he wanted, potentially to cut bean poles and pea sticks. And, one of the things we talk about is how you can become more self-sufficient. And whether you're a gardener or a professional grower, if you look at the things that you're buying in to make your garden work, actually a lot of them you could be growing yourself.
Yeah.
Even in a relatively small garden, you can be growing some of this stuff. So things like wood chip to make propagation compost, or even if you just had one hazel coppice in the corner of your garden, that could provide quite a lot. So it's thinking about sort of what you're spending money on, I guess, and whether there's a tree that will that will save you money by doing it yourself.
Yeah. Hazel, the hazel, as as plant support and so on, is brilliant. I've um I've used willow a little bit, but obviously it starts to regrow again, so that's not always
Yeah, no, exactly.
that's not always ideal. But yeah, hazel is a really good one. And you mentioned wood chip compost for propagating, and this is obviously one that's quite a hot topic over the last number of years, because we've gone away here in Ireland. We're still using peat
Yeah.
in propagation, and I think it's pretty much gone in the UK at this stage.
Yes, it's definitely on its way out.
Yeah,
But yeah.
but I suppose the biggest challenge for peat free has always been, from the point of view of sowing seeds, it's to get those EC levels stable enough to safely and consistently germinate seeds and grow on seedlings. That has been the challenge. What how do you make a germination compost, a seed sowing compost with wood chip? What's that
Well,
process?
in theory, it's very simple. So you literally compost it for anything between 18 months and 3 years, and sieve it, and then add something like a bit of perlite or vermiculite or biochar. So something that just sort of helps a little bit with the drainage. And certainly the trial we did with Tolly, we sowed leeks and cabbage. I think I'm saying cabbage now. I can't remember if it was lettuce, but anyway, and it was compared against the sort of leading peat-based commercial compost, and they basically performed the same.
Well,
And in fact, the leeks were even slightly healthier in the field, although we're not quite sure why.
yeah,
So so that was kind of impressive, and it is literally he piles wood chip that he gets from tree surgeons in a windrow. He adds a bit of his pack house waste, so a bit of the old sort of veg cuttings and all of that.
hmm
He turns it a couple of times over the year, and then he sieves. Then he takes a bit of it and sort of composts it further for another 6, 12 months, and then sieves it, and that's it.
yeah,
And it seems to work. Now we haven't obviously tested it on every crop, and it will. What you're using for the feedstock, I'm sure, will have some bearing on the quality.
yeah,
But it does seem that if you leave it to compost long enough, then some of those variables will even out.
yeah. So
Um,
it just seems to be it's all about time then.
Yeah, but the
It,
process is simple. I mean, I think you could literally fill some plastic bags with wood chip, leave them in the corner of your garden for 3 years, and then come back and sieve them, and I think it would work.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah, because that is the biggest downfall of peat-free compost, to be fair. It's just either inconsistent or poor germination, because obviously the EC levels are just not stable in it, whereas something like wood chip that has been given that period of whatever 3 years
yeah,
is going to be, again, it's going to be like what you'll find on a forest floor. If you scratch back the surface, it's going to be that type of a,
yeah. And
yeah,
I think one of the main problems for a lot of the commercial peat-free brands is they've got this time pressure. They've got to keep things moving, and they can't make any money if they have it sitting around too long composting. And
yeah,
so
yeah,
they rush the process to get stuff to market.
yeah.
And so, as you say, a lot of it isn't really suitable. I mean, some of it's not even suitable for putting on, but I think it is getting better, and there are an increasing number of brands that are delivering much better
Yeah, no, it,
product.
it,
So
it is
it's
improving.
definitely, yeah,
Yeah. And funny here that probably the leading brand here has quite a percentage of cocoa coir in it. And I really have my doubts on that, considering that we live in Ireland and like the sustainability or the eco-friendliness of that when it's come from the other side of the world. It might make sense if you're quite close by to its source, but I'm not so sure here. I really do question coir
yeah,
in compost here anyway, for sure.
yeah. Well, yeah, and I think if you can make it from something that you can grow, where you are, that definitely makes more sense to me. So.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you mentioned soil health, and as part of what you were saying there, you chatted about adding biochar. So I know soil health is something you talk a lot about, and it's something that's quite, I would regularly cover soil health and related topics on the podcast. And again, would call it the cornerstone of growing food, particularly. And pretty much any gardening is the cornerstone is your soil. What, when we come on to the soil association in a minute, but how do you go about building a healthy soil in your opinion? So you mentioned biochar, you mentioned spreading wood chip. Any other kind of good tips for building soil health?
It is. I mean, it's mainly about reducing the amount you do to it. So do as little as you can, which is why no dig systems work, and they're challenging commercially to get enough material, and they're quite labor intensive. But in a garden
Hmm.
situation, I mostly I would recommend no dig. When I started 30 years ago, there were still people double digging, and I
Hmm.
even at the time when I would really didn't know that very much at all. I thought this just seems like madness. Why?
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? Is invented just by someone who wants to, dig. But anyway, so I think reducing the amount you do to a soil is obviously crucial. Keeping it covered at all times, ideally with something living, is also really important. And building soil organic matter, so that whether that's compost, composted wood chip, um, but building up not just uh, the percentage of organic matter in your soil, and that will so most soils will have a limit to what you can do that and still maintain a balance, but you can also build the depth of your soil by increasing that biological activity, and a lot of the carbon is part of a cycle, so it's not necessarily sitting there doing nothing. It's sort of in and out, but the more active, generally the more active your soil is, the healthier it's going to be.
Mm.
And the biochar is interesting. I mean, I'm not a biochar evangelist, I would say, um, but I've done a few bits of trials with it, and I am really interested in it. I think it's got some real potential, particularly in really light sandy soils and in tunnels and glass houses and pots where you get quite a wide extreme of temperature and moisture. So it really helps to act as a buffer, because it's effectively like this sponge. It holds on to water and nutrients, so it makes a
Yeah.
most efficient use of what you've got. Um, there's also a theory that a lot of plants have evolved to respond to the presence of charcoal. So if you've got a forest fire, the things that grow quickest are the ones that are going to be successful. So there's a theory that they're naturally evolved to grow more quickly when there's charcoal in the soil. And that I guess what first got me interested in it, I did just a trial on my own with biochar. It was a coir-based compost actually, but some of it had biochar in and some of it didn't. And all of the trays that had biochar in germinated a day earlier and were greener.
Well,
And you look at it and just go, wow, I can see the difference. Now that didn't necessarily mean they grew any better once I planted them out, but I just thought, wow, there's something in that. So that got me interested. I've since done quite a lot of trials, and certainly where we've used it at Helen's in the fertile heavy clay, I've seen actually no benefit at all, particularly. I don't think it's done any harm, and it's I'm sure it's sequestered some carbon in there, but from a sort of crop and soil health point of view, I'm not sure we've benefited much, and obviously there's a cost to it. But I think I think there are situations where it can help, and certainly I know there are advocates out there that believe it's sort of a massive potential just in terms of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it long term in the soil. I guess I'm nervous about unintended consequences with some of that stuff where we go, yeah, let's throw lots of biochar in the soil, and then we don't really know what it'll do in all situations, probably. But yeah,
and there is a lot of here in Ireland. There's a huge biochar facility after being built, and they're able to produce huge amounts of material, and they're talking about different applications for that now at this stage. So there's a lot of talk about biochar at the moment. From my perspective, I have used biochar in not a very scientific way, but in created a new no-dig garden a couple of years ago, and all the beds got an application of biochar produced here in Ireland, and Dr. Karen O'Halloran, and she inoculates it with beneficial bacteria. So it's a little bit of a souped up biochar, for want of a better word. And on applying it to all beds, sorry, not all beds, because I was trying to see was there differences. By applying it on the beds in year one, so all these were newly created no-dig beds, and there was no obvious difference in year one, with the in the setup year, but there was definitely obvious benefits in year two and year three, where you're only putting the the really light layer of compost in the further years. And I thought there was an obvious benefit there, twofold: better growth, without a doubt, on the beds with biochar, but healthier plants. They just looked a little bit greener, slightly more vigorous on the ones that were where the biochar was applied. So I've since put it on all beds, but it wasn't obvious initially, but after year two, year three, it was quite clear.
Yeah, and I think I think soil systems take a while to react to any change, which is why long-term trials and observations are so crucial, because things happen slowly, or or then surprisingly 5 years down the line or something.
Yeah, for sure. The Silo Association, so obviously a hugely trusted body in the UK and here in Ireland as well. So tell us a little bit about, for people that don't know, tell us a little bit about the association, what it does, what its mission statement is, I guess.
Yeah, so we're a charity. We were founded in 1946 by a group of scientists, farmers, and health workers. So the sort of central mission, in a way, has always been to promote and support that link between healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy people, and a healthy planet. The In the 70s, we were one of the organizations that helped to develop the organic standards, and we set up at that time a certifying body as well. So we own a certification company, which is how a lot of people know us, and we certify organic farms and businesses. We also help to set up FSC, the timber mark. So we certify that worldwide, and some other sort of ethical standards as well. So So we do that, and then we do own another company now, which is Soil Association Exchange, which was set up 4 or 5 years ago, I think. Which the aim of that is to help farmers to monitor and benchmark their environmental and social outputs, and then potentially to tap into funding to help support it. I don't work for either of those companies. I work for the charity. I work in our farming and land use team. And what we do is quite broad, but primarily it's around things like supporting farmers to. I mean, I don't think this is the official way we talk about it anymore, but I quite like it as a way of describing it. So we work with farmers, our existing organic licensees. We work with them to help them, farm even better, or to access new markets, or whatever, around that, to sort of help them. We work with farmers to encourage them to certify as organic. So obviously, we believe organic certification is one way to benefit our charitable aims. So we would like to see more organic licensees, whether that's with the Soil Association or other licensing bodies. And then we also now increasingly work with farmers to make them, sort of in inverted commas, more organic. So we know that a lot of farmers will never want to be certified organic, and that's fine. But actually, a lot of them now are interested in things like cover crops, and rotations, and building soil organic matter, and particularly my area of agroforestry. I would say I work mostly with farmers that are not certified organic. And which I quite enjoy, to be honest. I'd never sort of I don't enjoy what's the word, sort of silos. I think we all benefit much more from talking to each other and learning from each other. And then we also do, as well as the work with farmers, so we run things like, we run events. We've got an agroforestry show coming up, for instance, in September, which would be great if any of your listeners wanted to come over to England and visit. But we run events, we run webinars, we produce fact sheets, we visit farms, we talk to people on telephone and emails, all of that sort of stuff. We then also work in policy. So we do have a policy team, but a lot of the people in my team, so there's something like 23 people now in our farming and land use team. So we've got a really wide range of expertise, sort of really around all farming and forestry. So we help to support our policy team to influence where we can, to influence government policy, and that would be sort of across the 4 devolved nations in the UK. And then we also get involved in some of the campaigning work that the charity does. There's always a little bit of a tension with some of our work, because we have a lot of public members who tend to push hard for change, and then we have a lot of farmer members who, while they're all very up for change, it just takes a bit longer sometimes. And so our campaigning team are often trying to sort of push a more radical message, and then our team is going, have you thought about how that's going to go down with the farmers? So that's quite interesting. And I guess then the final bit, which I get less involved in, is we have quite a big food strand of work. So do a lot of work with schools, hospitals and things like that, looking at supporting how to change diet and eating habits and things like that. So yeah, quite wide range. We're an unusual organization that we span sort of pretty much everything, which, as I said, it does create tensions, but it also, I think, gives us an unusual perspective on things. We are an environmental organization, but we're also a farming organization, and we're a campaigning organization, and we're a food so we do a lot of different stuff, which throws its challenges, but is quite exciting to work within. So
yeah, I could imagine the challenges, but I guess it's also probably a good angle, because, as you rightly said, the people who are campaigning, typically the public, are pushing for certain outcomes and certain bans and certain changes, and on the backside of that, then you have farmers who are running a business, have to make a living, and change, as you rightly said, is is and can be slow, because they have to know that this change is not going to impact the bottom line. That's
Yeah.
essentially it. And so, but you're in a
Then,
unique position in that you can navigate those two kind of different pillars.
well, I hope so. I'm not sure
Yeah.
we always get it right, but
No.
I mean, interesting. The peat discussion is a classic case of that, where as an organisation, we're right behind a ban, and I would say we've been over the decades, we've probably been one of the most proactive voices in reducing and removing peat. But equally, we've got to make sure that there are the products out there in sufficient quality and
Yeah.
quantity that when our commercial growers use them, they're not losing an entire crop because
Yeah.
that's their livelihood down the drain. So we can't do it at such speed that people go out of business.
Yeah.
But equally, if you don't do it fast enough, then nothing ever gets done. So
Hmm.
it's kind of
Yeah, no, and like here in Ireland, I think it's yeah, that's we've a strong tradition and heritage in peat in lots of ways. Going to the bog to cut turf is a
yeah,
was a big thing here in Ireland. It's probably less so now, but it is still here. And a couple of years ago there was the big clamor to ban peat products from growing. And while it's very hard to argue with that, the products just weren't there to replace them essentially
yeah,
today or tomorrow. And as I said earlier, one of the products that was being touted as being being a replacement was coir, and I just don't get that. Personally, I think it is, probably if you're right beside it at its source, it makes sense, but not when you're, on the other side of the world, in my opinion.
yeah.
So it's always a tricky one.
Yeah, and there's no point replacing one environmentally damaging product with another one, is there? So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And we have some kind of strange scenarios now where there's less harvesting going on the island of Ireland, but there's still a lot of peat coming in from other regions. And so while, we could say that we're not harvesting as much peat for horticulture, there's still probably as much being used,
they've
but
outsourced
it's just coming
it.
from somewhere else. Like, and I don't think that's certainly not the
No.
right approach either. So it's always a tricky one. Final question. You mentioned earlier on, you were chatting about food and how that was one of your biggest concerns going forward was how the world continues to feed itself in against the backdrop of changing climate and so on. Do you feel, because this has always been one of the arguments of conventional farming, do you believe that regenerative organic farming can sort of take up the capacity that's required?
I think it's the only way we're going to do it because I think the other systems will fail.
Hmm.
Some of them already failing, and the problem with the sort of big conventional farming system is it works really well when everything's right. So if you get a great year with just the right amount of rain, just the right amount of sun, and you can get out in the right time and plant the crops and harvest them, then you'll get really big yields. Um, but when anything goes wrong, the systems are vulnerable. So if you get a drought, they don't grow. If you get flooded, they don't grow. If you get a hurricane, they don't grow. Whereas systems that are lower yielding but more resilient will typically will deliver most years. So
Hmm.
you get this. There's been research looking at overall yield and profitability of systems, and a sort of high yielding intensive system, high input system, you'll have higher highs, but you'll have lower lows,
Hmm.
and the risk of doing it is therefore higher. To get those higher yields, you need to be spending a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah,
Whereas a low input or sustainable, looking for that sort of maximal sustainable output is to me makes a lot more sense. And certainly uh, in mixed vegetable systems, I think we're quite vulnerable to some of this stuff, and I think we have to be protecting it. So for me, a big part of it is about resilience, and we are going. We're already seeing uh, disruption in some of the supply chains. I think you know, I'm a very optimistic person by nature, but I think we've only just begun to see the tip of some of the problems that we're going to get. And actually, Ireland and the UK are quite well placed. We're going to see probably a lot of wind, and maybe a lot of rain at certain times, but actually we're not probably going to be hit as badly as a lot of places. So I think we need to prepare ourselves, I guess, and prepare our systems to be able to do that. And I think there's certainly, I was reading recently, there's a meta-analysis of horticultural agroforestry systems, and I think they reviewed something like 277 studies that had been done, and if I remember right, 245 of them showed increased productivity.
Wow.
Typically 20 or 30% more productive, but some of them were sort of 1.5 times, 2 times as productive. And so I think we know this stuff works, but it is a bit complex, and you've got to get your head around the design of it. But there's no question that it works. And to me, if we are gonna continue to produce good quantity, good quality food, we have to look at it. So
Yeah, for sure. And it's definitely gaining traction here. There's a lot of people adapting principles, those type principles, and yeah, it's something that's definitely growing in popularity, and yeah, hopefully we'll continue to do so. So yeah, it's been a really interesting chat. There's loads there. We could still probably talk for another few hours. There's different avenues, different potential things we could talk about, but it's been a really interesting chat. Where can people find you? I know all your books pretty much online, but you have your own website, so
so benraskin.uk is the website. Obviously, Soil Association's got a great website with lots of resources, and I think my details are on there as well. I'm on, all the Instagram, Blue Sky, Facebook, blah blah.
Yeah,
So all of that stuff.
So yeah, no, Ben, it's been really interesting chat. Loads there, as I said, that there's lots more we could talk about. So yeah, really, really interesting chat, and thank you very much for coming on Master My Garden podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks. I've really enjoyed it.
So that's been this week's episode. A huge thanks to Ben for coming on. Yeah, there's so much there you could get into. There's such obvious benefits with incorporating trees into your garden setting, into your market garden, if that's what you're doing. From a gardener's perspective, which I know many of you are, the soil health is a huge one. So we've spoke about it before, but I think you can clearly see that soil health is what it's all about. If you have good soil health, then you're going to have good crops. You're going to grow good fruit, vegetables for your family. So yeah, really interesting chat. And that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening. And until the next time, happy gardening.